When we talk about what built America, the story is usually the same: railroads, steel, oil, finance. But that's only part of the truth. Long before big tech, before Wall Street dominance, and before multinational corporations, America was powered by industries history quietly erased. Vast ice harvesting empires that cooled an entire nation before electricity, button factories that clothed millions of fueled regional economies, entire supply chains so essential that daily life depended on them. These weren't side businesses, they were economic titans employing thousands and shaping cities and influencing policy. And then they vanished. Not because they failed, but because technology, power, and progress shifted faster than they could survive. Tonight we uncover the forgotten industries that built America, prosperity who benefited from their rise, who profited from their disappearance, and that their collapse reveals about how power really moves in this country. This is the Unfiltered Political Lens Podcast. Welcome. Alrighty. At first glance, it looks like any ordinary American town, the kind that passed through without stopping. Brick buildings weathered by decades of wind and rain, and a quiet main street with more industry than foot traffic, and a water tower still bearing the faint outline of a company's name most people no longer recognize. And yet this town, like thousands of others across the United States, was once indispensable to the nation, not because it was flashy or famous, but because it sat at the center of the industry so essential that daily life across America quietly depended on it. An industry that built fortunes, shaped local politics, influenced national markets, and disappeared so thoroughly that most people today don't even realize it ever existed. And this is not an isolated story, it is a pattern repeated across the American landscape. Towns built around ice, buttons, glass, matches, typewriters, textiles, carriage, hardware, clockworks, coal byproducts, and countless other industries that were once foundational to American prosperity, but have since been erased from public memory. Not because they were insignificant, but because progress does not preserve what it replaces, and the story of these forgotten industries is not about nostalgia or longing for a simpler past. It is about understanding how power moves from our economic shift, how communities are built and then abandoned, and how the same forces that erase these giants are still reshaping American life today. Because before refrigeration, ice was not a luxury, and it was a lifeline harvested in massive quantities from frozen rivers and lakes stored in towering ice houses, insulated with sawdust and shipped across the country by rail. And shipped supplies, cities, hospitals, breweries, market packers, and households, creating a vast ice economy that employed tens of thousands of workers and generated enormous wealth in entire towns rose around the seasonal harvest with specialized tools, shipping networks, labor systems, and financial backings that rivaled modern logistics operations, and yet within a single generation, artificial refrigeration rendered natural ice obsolete, collapsing an entire industry almost overnight, leaving behind abandoned ice houses, unemployed workers, and towns forced to reinvent themselves or fade away. And the same story unfolded on the button industry, where small coastal towns and river communities became global suppliers of buttons carved from freshwater mussel shells, fueling fashion industry and export markets, disseminating river ecosystems, and sustaining local economies for decades until plastic and mass production made shell buttons uncompetitive, shutting down factories and drying up wages and leaving behind polluted waterways and communities stripped of their economic identity and what makes these stories important. It is not simply that industries disappear, but that their disappearance follows a familiar pattern, one in which innovation concentrates wealth elsewhere. Labor is disregarded, environmental costs remain local, and communities are expected to absorb the shock quietly. And this pattern repeats across American history, from textile mills in New England to coal towns in the Appalachia, from steel cities in the Midwest to manufactured hubs followed out by globalization, and each time the official narrative frames the collapse as inevitable, as progress, as a natural evolution of markets, while rarely examining who benefits, who pays the price, and who gets left behind. And then we look closely at the forgotten industries. We begin to see their rise and fall, not just economic events, but political ones, shaped by policy decisions and infrastructure investments, corporate consolidation, and government priorities that favored efficiency over stability. Profits over people in the matters today, because the same forces are now reshaping industries that millions of Americans still depend on, from trucking and retail, from agriculture to energy, from journalism to manufacturing. And just an ice harvester and button makers were told their industries were outdated. Workers today are told retain, relocate, or accept. We're told their industries are outdated. Workers today that their livelihoods are collateral damage in the march for progress, and yet restraining does not rebuild towns. Relocation fractures families, and the economic transitions are rarely as clean or humane as they are portrayed. And then we walk through towns like this one, which its quiet streets and fading signs. We're not walking through failure, we're walking through evidence. Evidence that America's economic story has always been a creative destruction paired with selective memory, where the winners are celebrated and the losers are forgotten. And this selective memory allows the same mistakes to be reported, because when industries vanish without acknowledgement, their workers vanish from their national conversation. Their skills are devalued, and their communities are stigmatized, and their struggles are reframed as as personal shortcomings rather than systemic outcomes. And this is why these stories are so relevant today. Because understanding how America was built requires understanding what was dismantled and who made those decisions and who bore the consequences. As we explore these forgotten industries, we are not just uncovering curiosities from the past, we are tracing blueprints of modern economic disruption where technology accelerates. Change is faster than social systems can adapt, where corporate consolidation erases the competition and the local control, where efficiency is rewarded even when it destabilizes entire regions, and their language of progress often masks the reality of displacement. And this raises uncomfortable questions about the present, about which industries today are being quietly phased out, and which communities are being written off as expendable, and which decisions made in boardrooms and legislatures will define the economic geography of the decisions made next generation. And it also challenges the ideas that America's prosperity was built solely by famous names and headlined industries, because much of the nation's wealth was generated by ordinary people doing essential work in industries of history chose not to remember. People who harvested ice in brutal winters, who carved buttons by hand, or who ran machines in defining factories, who built supply chains long before the term existed, and whose labor made modern life possible. And as we move forward in this series, we will continue uncovering these forgotten giants, not to romanticize win, but to understand and to see how innovation can both create and destroy. However, economic shifts ripple outward into culture and politics and how the past offers warnings we ignore at our own risk. And we begin with ice, not because it's exotic, but because it's ordinary. Because it reminds us that most transformative industries are often the ones we take for granted. The ones we only notice when they are gone, and the lessons embedded in these fading footprints is clear that America's economic strength has always depended on industries that seemed permanent until they weren't, and the true cost of progress is rarely measured in profits alone, but in the lives, towns, and histories left behind. Where we don't just ask questions, or this is a place where we don't just ask questions or replace these industries, but why their disappearances was allowed to happen the way it did, and what tells us about the future we are building now. When America led the world, it was not always through grand invention announced on global stages or corporations whose names would become permanent fixtures in history. Books, but almost or books often through industries so practical and so embedded in daily life that their significance was almost invisible while they existed, and nowhere is it clearer than in the rise of the natural ice industry of the 19th century and early 20th. The industry transformed the United States into the world's premier supplier of cold long before electricity, refrigeration, or climate control became commonplace. Because ice was not merely a convenience, it was infrastructure harvested with winter from frozen lakes and rivers across the northern states, cut by hand into massive blocks using specialized saws and plows, hauled by horse-drawn sleds, and later rail systems, stored in towering ice houses insulated with sawdust and straw, and distributed through logistics networks so sophisticated that it rivaled modern supply chains reaching homes, hospitals, breweries, meatpacking plants, fishing fleets, and even ships bound to tropical ports. And this system did not emerge accidentally, but through relentless American innovation, where entrepreneurs redefined harvesting techniques. Engineers improved storage efficiency and railroad expansion, which allowed ice cut in New England, in the Midwest, and upstate New York to reach cities across the nation. And beyond making the United States a global leader in the industry, I'm sorry. Across the nation and beyond, making the United States a global leader in industry, few other countries could match at scale, and for the men and families who lived within this world, ice was not an obstruction, but a way of life, with winter harvest dictating economic rhythms, entire communities mobilizing during freezing season, children growing up knowing the sound of saws biting into frozen water, and laborers enduring brutal cold in exchange for steady wages that supported the families year round. While ice delivery became a daily ritual in urban life, shaping agriculture through ice boxes, influencing food preservation, public health, and even social norms, because the ability to store food safely reduced the illness and stabilized diets and supported growth. Urban populations, and in this way, ice quietly reshaped American identity as a nation capable of mastering nature through discipline, coordination, and scale, reinforcing a cultural belief in industriousness, ingenuity, and the promise that hard work within a growing system could produce stability and upward mobility, especially for immigrants and working class families who found opportunity in the industries that were rewarded endurance and reliability rather than elite education, in towns built around ice harvesting flourished as regional hubs funding schools, churches, local newspapers, and civic institutions, embedding the industry into the social and political fabric of American life. While at the national level, ICE became a symbol of American political fabric of the American life, while the national level, ICE became a symbol of American efficiency and reach, exported overseas and praised as evidence that the United States could organize labor, technology, and transportation more effectively than older industry powers. And yet, what made the ice industry truly emblematic of American dominance was not just its scale, but its integration, how it connected rural labor and urban demand, seasonal work, to year-round markets, and the knowledge of a national distribution, creating a self-reinforcing ecosystem that seemed permanent to those living inside it. And this sense of prominence shaped expectations, encouraging families to plan futures around the trade, municipalities to invest in infrastructure tailored to it, and policymakers to treat as a stable pillar of the economy, which reinforcing the broader American narrative that progress only achieved was secure and that dominance once established would endure. And if precisely this assumption that makes the story so instructive, because the ice industry represents a moment when America truly led the way, not by dominant headlines, but by solving a universal human problem at an unprecedented scale, embedding that solutions into daily life and building a national identity, beautiful life and building a national identity around the belief that ingenuity and labor could tame even the harshest constraints of nature, a belief that would echo through later industrial triumphs and shape how Americans came to understand their place in this world. The decline did not arrive as a single moment of dramatic collapse, but as a series of quiet disruptions that taken individually seem manageable, even promising, yet together would unravel industries once thought permanent, because as the 20th century approached, new technologies began to undermine the very foundations of American industrial dominance, with mechanical refrigeration emerging not as an immediate replacement for natural ice, but as a supplemental innovation that slowly proved more reliable and more predictable and less dependent on weather, while petroleum-based energy expanded access to electricity and powered machines that could operate year-round without seasonal constraints. And at the same time, the consumer habits began to shift as urban households embraced convenience, businesses demanded consistency, and municipal planners favored centralized systems over decentralized labor. Intensive operations eroding the economic logic that had sustained industries like ice harvesting, and these changes were compounded by global competition and industrial consolidation, as corporations with the access to capital invested in refrigeration infrastructure absorbed smaller competitors and lobbied of policies that favored the modernization and preservation, leaving independent operators increasingly marginalized. And for the workers and entrepreneurs caught in the transition, the decline was not abstract but deeply personal, experienced in shrinking contracts, shortened seasons, layoffs, and slow realization the skills honored over a lifetime were becoming obsolete. With ice harvesters watching winter shorten and demand weaken, factory owners struggling to finance costly upgrades, they did not fully understand the delivery workers displaced by electric systems that eliminated the need to daily labor, and historical accounts describe men returning home early from the winter harvest with empty hands. Families forced to sell equipment at a fraction of its value, and business owners who had once been respected pillars of their communities quietly closing their doors, often burdened by the debt and stigma rather than the sympathy and this human cost, which unfolded largely out of public view because progress was framed as improvement, not loss, and the narrative of innovation left little room to acknowledge the workers, left little room for the acknowledged workers left behind, and today the evidence of this decline remains etched into the American landscape, visible in the abandoned ice houses along the riverbanks, the rusted rails that once carried frozen cargo, and the empty factory floors where machinery still sits in silence in small towns whose populations dwindled as young people left in search of work elsewhere, creating modern ghost towns defined not only by sudden catastrophe, but by the slow erosion in archival photographs captured. This transition is the stark detail, bustling harvest scenes replaced by empty warehouses, proud company signing, fading into the brick delivery wagons, giving way to wires of compressors, while contemporary footage reveals how these spaces have been repurposed, neglected, to simply left to decay, serving as a physical reminders that economic shifts leave scars long after balance sheets move on. And when viewed together, these images and stories reveal that the seeds decline were not planted by failure or incompetence, but by the convenience of technological progress in the markets. The incentives and policy choices that prioritize efficiency over continuity, and in doing so, transformed once vital industries into footnotes, leaving behind communities to navigate the transformed consequences alone, and a pattern that continues to repeat as the modern economies accelerate. Consequences along a pattern accelerate change without fully reckoning, with its human and social costs. This disappearance of these dominant industries did not mark the end of their influence, but rather beginning of a quarter legacy that continues to shape the American economy, labor landscape, and cultural memory in ways that often are overlooked. Because the collapse of industries like ice harvesting, whaling, and early manufacturing accelerated shifts in labor organizations, prompting early debates over workers' protection, the seasonal employment stability, and the responsibility of employers during technological transitions, debates that would later inform the development of labor laws on employment insurance and workplace safety standards, while at the same time the economic vacuum left behind reshaped regional demographics as workers migrated from former industrial hubs to growing urban centers, contributing to patterns of urbanization, suburban expansion, and regional inequality that persists today. And in many cases, the infrastructure left behind by these industries become the foundation for new economic uses, with old rail lines transformed into computer routes, to industrial transports becoming sites of tourism and recreation, subtly influencing modern economic development strategies. And beyond economics, the cultural imprint of these industries endures a local folklore, museum exhibits, family stories passed down through generations, and even a contemporary business that borrow names, imagery, or craftsmanship, traditions from their industrial past, not as replicas of what once was, but as continue to draw of these histories to explore themes of resilience, loss, and transformation. Continue to draw on these histories to explore themes of resilience, loss, and transformation, ensuring that while the industries themselves may be gone, their human stories remain. Embedded in the cultural fabric, and perhaps the most important legacy, lies in the lessons these histories offer and the adaptability of resilience, because they remind us that no industry, no matter how dominant, is immune to disruption and technological progress. Without social planning, can fracture communities, and economic resilience depends not only on innovation but on the ability of institutions and societies to support workers through transition, and as the modern economy faces automation, artificial intelligence, and rapid shifts in energy and supply chains, which these are forgotten histories, serve as cautionary guides, urging a more deliberate approach to change, one that values human capital alongside urging a more deliberate approach to change. I keep repeating myself. One that values human capital alongside efficiency, anticipates displacement rather than reacting to it, and recognizing that the future of work will be shaped not just by what we intend, but how we choose to carry forward the people and places built by what came before. The disappearance of these once dominant industries did not mark the end of their influence, but rather the beginning of a quieter legacy that continues to shape the American economy and labor landscape and cultural memory in ways that are often overlooked because of the collapse of industries like ice harvesting, whaling, and early manufacturing accelerated shifts in labor organizations, prompting early debates over the workers' protections. Seasonal employment stability and responsibility of employers during technological transitions, debates that would later inform the development of labor laws, unemployment insurance, and workplace safety standards, while at the same time the economic vacuum left behind reshaped regional demographics as workers migrated from former industrial hubs to growing urban centers. Contributing to patterns of urbanization, suburban expansion, and regional inequality that persist today, and in many cases the infrastructure left behind by these industries become the foundation for new economic uses, with old rail lines transformed into computer routes, former factories repurposed as warehouses, studios are lost, and riverfronts once dedicated to industrial transport become sites of tourism and recreation, subtly influencing modern economic development strategies. And beyond economics, the cultural imprint of these industries endures in folklore, museum exhibits, family stories passed down through the generations, and even the contemporary business that borrow names, imagery, or craftsmanship traditions from their industrial past today as replicas of what once was, but as acknowledgments of identity rooted in labor and place of artists, writers, and filmmakers continue to draw these histories to explore themes of resilience, loss of transformation, ensuring that the industry themselves may be gone. Their human stories remain embedded in the cultural fabric, and perhaps the most important legacy lies in the lessons these histories offer about adaptability and resilience, because they remind us that no industry, no matter how dominant, is immune to disruption, that technological progress without social planning can fracture communities, and that the economic resilience depends not only on innovation but as the ability of institutions and societies to support workers through transition. And as the modern economy faces automation, artificial intelligence, and rapid shifts in energy and supply chains, these forgotten histories serve as a cautionary guides, urging a more deliberate approach to change, on that values human capital alongside efficiency, anticipates displacement, rather than reacting to it, and recognizing that the future of work will be shaped not just by what we invent, but how much we choose to carry forward the people and places built by what came before. Behind every forgotten industry were individuals whose names rarely appear in textbooks, but whose decisions, labor, and perseverance shape entire regions. Innovators who redefined tools and processes long before the automation, entrepreneurs who took enormous risks to solve everyday problems at scale, and community leaders who fought to adapt rather than abandon their towns as economic tides shifted. People who experimented with hybrid systems, lobbied for infrastructure investments, restrained workers were possible and sought new uses of old facilities even as the market moved against them. And while many ultimately failed to stop the deep on ordinary people responding creatively to extraordinary change and recognizing these ensuing pioneers matters not because it writes outcomes, but because it restores agency to the narrative, reminding that the economic transitions are not impersonal force of the impersonal force of agency. Visiting small museums, listening to elders, and paying attention to the economic layers beneath modern landscapes, we begin to see our own communities not as static backdrops, but as evolving systems shaped by past industries and past decisions, and this awareness equips us to engage more thoughtfully with present challenges from automation and globalization to climate transition and workforce displacement. Because remembering these stories is not about resisting change, but about approaching it with humility, foresight, and our responsibilities, and as America's once again stands at the edge of profound economic transformation, the lessons of these unseen pioneers offer a blueprint, one that emphasizes adaptability without abandonment, innovation without erasure, and progress that accounts for people's wealth and productivity. And in carrying these stories forward, we preserve more than history. We preserve the insight needed to build a future that learns from its past rather than repeat it. America's lost industries did not simply fade away as relics or a bygone era, nor are they casualties of a failure or incompetence, but the result of a complex intersection of innovation, economic power, political decision-making, and cultural amnesia, which reshaped the nation and from ice harvesting, whaling, to textile mills, button factories, and early manufacturing daily routines, regional identities, and national supply chains, and in doing so, which created the prosperity and stability and opportunity for millions of Americans. Yet as new corporate consolidation accelerated, these industries were quietly dismantled rather than ceremoniously retired, often replaced by systems that favored efficiency, capital concentration, and the predictability over labor continuity and community stability, leaving workers to absorb the shock of obsolescence. With little support in towns to navigate economic collapse largely on their own, and while the officers' narrative framed their investments flowed, whose livelihoods were protected, which regions were prioritized, and which were allowed to decline, choices that reveal how power operates during periods of transformation, and the evidence that really happened remains visible in abandoned infrastructure, altered demographics, and lingering cultural memory, as well as the modern labor laws, economic geography, and the social divisions that trace their origins to these moments of disruption. And when examined honestly, America's lost industries do not tell a story of decline alone, but of a reoccurring cycle in which innovation advances faster than the social systems can adapt. Prosperity concentrates while responsibility diffuses, and the history simplified to justify outcomes rather than interrogate them. And understanding what really happened is not an exercise in nostalgia, a blame, but a necessary step toward recognizing the pattern shaping today's economy. Because the same forces that erase these industries are now transforming modern work through automation, artificial intelligence, globalization, and energy transition, and without confronting how past transitions were managed and mismanaged, the nations risk repeating the same mistakes, sacrificing communities in the name of progress while failing to plan the human cost. And in the sense, America lost industries, which are not truly lost at all but embedded in the present, offering lessons about resilience, accountability, and the kind of future that emerges when economic changes and guided by intention rather than inevitability. The ghost factories that do American landscape stand as silent witness to an era which in inequality, labor, and ambition converged to build an industrial powerhouse placed by hand and a system designed to solve real human needs at unprecedented scale because these factories were once alive with motion and purpose, producing everything from ice and textiles to the machinery, glass, and everyday goods that sustained a growing nation. And within their walls, generations of workers learned skills, earned wages, and formed identities. And these same forces that fueled their rise also set the stage of their collapse as technological advances, corporate consolidation, global competition, and shifting political priorities the priorities and markets shifted overseas. These factories were not gradually retired but abundantly abandoned, leaving behind empty shelves filled with rusted equipment, cracked windows, and fading synagogue signage, physical evidence of how quickly the economic value can be reassigned. And the stories embedded in these spaces reveal that the collapse was rarely the result of a single failure, but of a layered decision that prioritized speed, scale, and profit over continuity, often ignoring the social ecosystems that had grown around these workplaces. And today, those ghost factories persist not only as ruins but as untold narratives, influencing regional decline, shaping modern labor policy debates, and inspiring contemporary artists, historians, and entrepreneurs who seek to understand or repurpose the remains. And in confronting these sites honestly, we uncover a deeper truth about the American ingenuity, that it is capable of extraordinary creation and equally capable of to erasure, and that legacy of these factories is not simply what they produce, but what their disappearance teaches us about the cost of progress, the fragility of economic certainty, and the responsibility to remember the human stories embedded in the industrial foundations of the nation. Beyond the Rust Belt lies a deeper and often overlooked story of American industry, one that stretches far beyond steel mills and assembly lines and encompasses a vast network of forgotten enterprises that once powered the nation in quiet but essential ways, because while the Rust Belt has become a symbol of industrial decline, the reality is the economic erasure touched by coastal towns and rural communities, river valleys, and port cities where industries such as ice harvesting, whaling, timber processing, textiles, shipbuilding, glass making, mining, before modern globalization, structured daily life, shaped migration patterns, influenced local politics, and embedded markets shifted and capital consolidated. Many of these sectors were dismantled or displaced with little public reckoning. Their collapse framed a natural evolution rather than the results of policy decisions, corporate strategy, and shifting national priorities. And the secrets buried within these forgotten industries reveal how progress often came at the expense of the continuity, leveling behind environmental damage, Hollywood, out of towns, and generations of workers whose skills were rendered obsolete overnight. And although their physical footprints remain in abandoned docks, empty mills, polluted rivers, and repurposed warehouses, their deeper legacy persists in modern economic inequality, regional instability, and debates of labor, trade, and technological disruptions. And by looking beyond the Rust Belt to uncover these hidden histories, We gain a more complete understanding of how America was built and unbuilt, and how the same forces that once erased these industries continue to reshape the nation's economic future, reminding us that what is forgotten is often what holds the most valuable lessons of navigating change. Revealed beneath the surface of the America celebrated progress is a quieter history of the industries the nation left behind, enterprises that once formed backbones of everyday life and economic stability before being rendered indivisible by technological change and shifting markets and the deliberate policy choices, because these industries ranging from ice harvesting and whaling to textile, glassmaking, small-scale manufacturing, and regional resources solved essential problems, provided livelihoods in millions, and shaped the identities of entire communities. Yet as innovation accelerated and capital sought greater efficiency and progress, the remainder of them matters not as an exercise of nostalgia, but as a means of understanding how economic power shifts, how labor is valued and disregarded, and how the costs of transformation are often borne to those least able to influence its direction. And when we trace consequences of these losses, we see their imprint in modern labor laws, regional inequality, environmental legacies, and cultural memory, which in revealing that the past is not separate from the present, but deeply embedded within it. And by bringing these forgotten industries back to focus, we gain more than historical insights. We gain a framework for that stories of what America left behind continue to inform the choices shaping what comes next. From the boom to bust, America's hidden industrial histories reveal a cycle of creation and collapse that has quietly shaped the nation. Far more than headlines of celebrated success and suggest, because behind every period of explosive growth stood industries that rose rapidly to meet urgent needs and organized labor and technology at unprecedented scales, and anchored entire regions in prosperity, only to be dismantled when innovation market shifts of political priorities rendered them inconvenient and unprofitable. And these industries, from ice harvesting and whaling to textile glass making, shipbuilding, and shipbuilding and economic life that structure daily routines and influence migration and define community identity. Yet when their decline began, it unfolded gradually and unevenly, masked by the language of progress, while workers faced shrinking opportunities in towns where they lost tax bases and physical infrastructure was abandoned in place, leaving behind empty factories, polluted waterways, and demographic shifts that continue to shape regional inequality, and unearthing those histories exposes the human dimensions of economic transformation, revealing how these histories expose the human dimensions. Innovation without planning fractures communities, how consolidation concentrates power while dispersing responsibility, and how the stories of those who built the nation are often clearer understood of the present, recognizing that the modern disruptions driven by the automation of globalization and technological acceleration follow their family patterns, and that the lessons embedded in America's forgotten industries offer no warning alone, but guidance on how to navigate future change with greater foresight and resilience and respect for the people who work under rights progress. I'm sorry, hold on. Okay, I done that. From boom to bust, America's hidden industrial history. I'm sorry, the forgotten founders scattered across the American landscape echo the story of the past economy built on ingenuity, labor, and the belief that productive work could anchor both economies, communities, and national prosperity, because these sites were once engines of growth where raw materials were transformed into the tools, machines, and goods that powered expansion, shaping regional identity and sustained generations of families. Yet as technology advanced, markets shifted, and economic power consolidated many of these foundries. And the industries connected to them were sidelined and abandoned, not because they failed to matter, but because the systems that replaced them valued speed, scale, and efficiency over continuity and local stability. And the closure of these operations rippled outward, allowing out towns, disrupting labor networks, and leaving behind physical structures that now stand as a silent witness to choices made far beyond their walls. And while rusted beams, empty floors, and crumbling facades tell a story of decline, the deeper echo lies how these industries shape modern labor laws, economic geography, and cultural memory, while influencing debates over work fairness and resilience that continue today. And by listening to the echoes of America's past economy embedded in these forgotten foundries, we gain more than historical awareness. We gain perspective on the patterns that still govern the economic change, reminding us that the future of work is inseparable from the way we remember or choose to forget the industries that once built the nation. As we close this chapter, remember that the industries we've explored tonight were never just factories, machines, or supply chains. They were people, communities, and the livelihoods woven into the foundation of this country, and where progress moved on the consequences of how it moved still shape our economy and our politics and our sense of stability today. Because the past doesn't disappear when we stop talking about it. It lingers, abandoned buildings and fractured towns, and in patterns of repeating themselves as new technologies reshape work. Once the community to notice what they built before, what existed now, and to ask what lessons are being ignored as the future accelerates. And if you believe these conversations matter, support the channel by liking the video and sharing it with others. And subscribe to the Unfiltered Political Lens Podcast, because understanding where we've been is the first step towards deciding where we're going next. And please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a good day.